The Killers, number one, is the most important comic book that I own in regards to the impact that it has had on the comic book industry, because it was one of many that were included in the 1954 book Seduction of the Innocent, which was written by psychiatrist Frederick Wortham to warn parents about how all the violence, the sex, the drug use, and other adult themes found in comics encouraged children to engage in those same behaviors and was a serious cause of juvenile delinquency. Now, that book contributed to a moral panic among parents where they began to campaign for the censorship of comic books. In some cities like Houston and Oklahoma City even banned horror and crime comics. There were public burnings of comics, and Congress actually launched an inquiry to study the effects of the comic book industry on children. And this inquiry was led by Senator Estes Kefauver, who was known to be a mob hunter. And because at the time, the mob was actually known to be connected with the distribution of comic books, he saw this as an opportunity to take the mob down. And this eventually led to Wortham appearing before the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency, where he testified that the comic book industry was like Hitler. And of course, this is in the 50s where Hitler is fresh on people's minds. And so, of course, again, this continues to stir up the panic that people have. But ultimately, the subcommittee found that comics were not responsible for crime. But unfortunately for the comic book industry, the damage had already been done because this hearing had been televised in this new era of television, so people were glued to their sets. And it concerned parents enough that so many stopped buying comics for their kids that in just a few months, 15 comic companies went out of business. And although the Senate subcommittee did not find the comic industry to be responsible for crime, they still did recommend that the industry voluntarily tone down its content. And this is what eventually led to the establishment of the Comics Code Authority, where comic publishers began to self-censor their comics in effort to avoid eventual government regulation. And so companies began to submit their comics to the Comics Magazine Association of America to be screened for harmful content before they were published. And as long as the association found the content to be acceptable, it would then give permission for the Comics Code seal of approval to be put on the comics. And although the Comics Code Authority had no actual legal authority, distributors began to refuse to carry comics unless they had the Comics Code seal. And so by default, companies had to go through them. And this lasted for about 50 years until the early 2000s, where one by one, different publishers began to say, hey, well, I don't care about having this code anymore. And distributors began to be willing to still carry those comics. But it's amazing that the Seduction of the Innocent book had power over the whole industry for those 50 years. Especially because later, in the 2000s especially, it was found that Wortham manipulated the data just a little bit as he exaggerated the number of times that violence was in comics. And for his sample size, he primarily studied children that already had behavioral disorders. So in other words, he already went to people who were juvenile delinquents and said, hey, do you read comics? Oh yeah, see, this proves my theory. And of course, we all know correlation does not imply causation, but this is not how he approached it. And of course, he neglected to tell people of all these children who read comics and were okay. Now, some of the things he wrote in the book were just completely manipulations. So, for instance, he talked about how an issue of Captain Marvel had a person without a head. And of course, if you're just reading this, you're thinking, oh man, did somebody get decapitated? Well, not exactly, because what actually happened in that issue is that Captain Marvel was sprayed with some invisible ink, and so his face just turned invisible. Pretty harmless, one of the stupid gimmicks of things that happened in the Silver Age, but Wortham said, oh, you're a man without a head. Or he also talked about how Blue Beetle was this Kafka-esque monstrosity. If you haven't read Kafka, he wrote this book where this man kind of metamorphosizes into this gross insect. But we all know the Blue Beetle isn't actually a beetle man, but it's just this man that's taken on this beetle costume, but he's just a regular guy. And Wortham even said that Superman was a Nazi. Now, I know what you're thinking, especially in those days. Superman fought for truth, justice, and the American way. How could he be a Nazi? Well, Wortham pointed to how the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was a major influence on Hitler. And if you've read any of Nietzsche, you know that he promoted the coming of the Übermensch, also known as the Superman. And so Wortham said, hey, this Superman is actually basically code for Nietzsche's Superman, the Nazi Superman, and said a lot of other things about him. Said, this S he bears on his chest might as well be the SS, the Nazi elite guard. So once again, clearly Wortham was manipulating some things, but I'm curious, even though that is true, do you think his theory holds any water? Is it true that comics can influence children in negative ways? In my lifetime, this crusade has been picked up through different media. I remember in the 80s, Tipper Gore led kind of this campaign against rock and rap music, which led to CDs. Yeah, if any of you are old enough to remember CDs being around, CDs and video games carrying parental advisory warning labels. And then in the 2000s, you've heard things about how video games like Grand Theft Auto can lead to crime. Is there any truth to that? What do you think? Now, as for what I personally think, I do think that media can have a major impact on children, but I don't think it does in the ways that parents are concerned about in these instances. In other words, I don't think a kid goes and reads a comic where someone is beheaded and says, hey, well, that's what I'm going to do. Instead, I think what's actually more dangerous are subtle themes of consumerism and hedonism that can be found in lots of media. And as a parent, that's actually what I get more concerned about with my children. There are movies that I know, especially when it comes to violence, some parents would be wary of letting their kids watch. We just watched Lord of the Rings, for instance. And obviously there's a lot of violence in that. But I personally even let my younger children watch that movie because I think it's overall themes of sacrifice and loyalty and all of that is what's more important than these violent things that are happening. I don't think my kids are going to look to, try to kill some orcs or pretend real people are orcs. But that's just me. I know a lot of parents think very differently than me on that front. And if you do, this is no way to, slam you that's just my own personal standard. I look more for the themes that are being advocated versus the actual actions. Now, even having said that, there is somewhere where we draw the line. Like, with my kids, I wouldn't just let them watch some sex scenes. I get a lot more concerned about that than I do about violence. And I guess that's because I'm more concerned with the possibility that my kids could become a sex addict rather than a murder addict. But again, it's tough. Parenting is tough. And so I'm just kind of saying my own thoughts here. I might change my mind on some things and never let my kids watch Lord of the Rings if you can convince me in the comments below. But if you're a parent especially, where do you draw lines in regards to what things you'll let your kids be exposed to? I mean, there certainly are comics that I wouldn't let my younger kids read. And so there's age appropriate things. But again, I don't think it's going to lead them to kill someone. But, you know, do you disagree? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Now, of course, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, I'd appreciate it if you consider doing so now. Like, again, comment on the video, all those things that help us out.